Throughout history, prisons have served as places of punishment, rehabilitation, and control. But in some of the world's most corrupt institutions, these facilities became hotbeds of brutality, exploitation, and lawlessness. Corrupt prisons weren't just filled with dangerous criminals, they were often run by them. Prison guards and officials, driven by greed, turned a blind eye to murder, torture, and human trafficking, making life behind bars even more dangerous than life outside. From the depths of medieval dungeons to the most notorious prisons of the modern era, corruption has poisoned systems meant to uphold justice, transforming them into dens of unimaginable horror. One of the most infamous examples of a corrupt prison was Black Beach Prison in Equatorial Guinea. Originally built as a facility to house political prisoners, Black Beach became synonymous with torture, disease, and inhumane conditions. Guards extorted inmates for food, medicine, and even basic shelter. Those who couldn't pay suffered violent beatings, prolonged isolation, or death. Reports from survivors spoke of prisoners being left in dark, rat-infested cells for months, subjected to physical and psychological torment by the very officials who were supposed to maintain order. Similarly, La Sabanita prison in Venezuela was a hellscape where corruption allowed violent gangs to seize control. Designed for just 700 inmates, it eventually held over 3,700, creating an environment where prison officials could no longer, or simply refused to, enforce the law. Instead, inmates ruled with iron fists, and those with money could buy their safety. Extortion rackets ran rampant, and brutal massacres took place as rival factions fought for dominance. Guards were often bribed to smuggle in drugs and weapons, making the prison one of the deadliest in the world. In Thailand, the infamous Bang Kwang Central Prison, also known as the Bangkok Hilton, earned a reputation for extreme corruption and cruelty. Overcrowding and underfunding turned it into a breeding ground for suffering. Prisoners faced beatings and arbitrary punishments unless they could pay off guards. Even basic necessities like food and water were controlled through bribery. Inmates without money relied on scraps or were forced into hard labor under threat of violence. Death row prisoners wore iron shackles welded to their legs, a grim reminder of the prison's reputation for harsh and inhumane treatment. Another deeply corrupt institution was the Carandiru Penitentiary in Brazil. With its long history of human rights abuses, the prison was infamous for its lack of order, extreme violence, and deeply entrenched corruption. Guards turned a blind eye to gang warfare in exchange for bribes, and conditions inside were unbearable. Diseases like tuberculosis and HIV ran rampant, with little to no medical care provided. The corruption came to a brutal climax in 1992, when police stormed the prison to suppress a riot, massacring 111 inmates in cold blood. Many of those killed had surrendered or were hiding, but they were executed anyway, exposing the brutal reality of the system. In Africa, Uganda's Luzira prison is a place where money determines survival. Bribery is an unspoken rule, with guards expecting payments for everything from food to medical attention. Those who can't afford it are left to rot in appalling conditions. Inmates sleep on bare floors, packed into overcrowded cells where disease spreads unchecked. While officially a maximum security prison, Luzira is controlled not by guards but by an informal hierarchy where wealth dictates power. Those with money buy privileges like extra rations, visitation rights, or even early release. The corrupt prison system extends far beyond individual facilities. It is a reflection of broader governmental failure. For example, in Russia, the infamous Black Dolphin prison operates under a veil of secrecy and corruption. Officially a high-security institution housing the country's worst criminals, Black Dolphin is notorious for the harsh treatment of its prisoners. Inmates live under constant surveillance, subjected to grueling physical punishments and deprived of basic rights. While the Russian government portrays it as an impenetrable fortress of law and order, reports suggest that bribery plays a significant role in determining how inmates are treated and whether they receive any form of leniency. Even in the United States, corruption within prisons has flourished. The Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as Angola Prison, was notorious for its use of forced labor and racial abuse. Originally a slave plantation, Angola continued its brutal legacy by forcing inmates, predominantly black men, to work under conditions reminiscent of the antebellum South. Corrupt prison officials ensured that violence and exploitation thrived, often colluding with inmate gangs to maintain control. Guards accepted bribes in exchange for protection, while those who refused to participate in the system faced horrific abuse and neglect. Perhaps the most infamous prison in modern times is the São Paulo State Penitentiary, where corruption is so deeply embedded that officials openly profit from inmate suffering. Gangs run the facility with the cooperation of guards, smuggling in drugs and weapons while enforcing their own laws. Money dictates everything, from access to clean water to personal safety. Guards, rather than maintaining order, act as brokers for extortion schemes, ensuring that the wealthiest inmates live in relative comfort while the poorest suffer immensely. Bribery has become the foundation of many of these institutions, where survival depends on the ability to pay off guards and other prisoners. Those who can't afford to do so face severe consequences, from starvation to violent attacks orchestrated by corrupt officials. São Paulo's prison system isn't just a case of negligence. It's a carefully crafted structure where the powerful exploit the weak. The corruption extends beyond the prison walls, influencing law enforcement and judicial decisions. Judges and prosecutors have been known to accept bribes, ensuring that influential inmates either receive reduced sentences or avoid imprisonment altogether. This creates a system where wealth and connections determine justice, rather than the rule of law. In many corrupt prisons, drug cartels and organized crime groups hold more power than the official administration. They control entire cell blocks, run drug trafficking operations, and even dictate who lives and who dies. The guards, rather than preventing these crimes, become accomplices, facilitating the trade in exchange for financial incentives. One of the most brutal aspects of these corrupt prisons is the treatment of political prisoners. In many authoritarian regimes, prisons are used not only to detain criminals but to silence dissent. Activists, journalists, and opposition members are thrown into facilities where they are tortured, isolated, and often never seen again. A prime example of this is Evin Prison in Iran, notorious for housing political prisoners under extreme conditions. Former inmates have recounted horrific tales of psychological and physical torture, with guards acting as enforcers for the regime. Corruption ensures that prisoners without powerful connections remain in detention indefinitely, regardless of the legal process. In some prisons, inmates are forced to pay for their own incarceration. In the Philippines' New Bilibid prison, for example, inmates must purchase their own bedding, food, and even space in a cell. Those who cannot afford it are forced into overcrowded conditions where disease and violence are rampant. Extortion is another major issue in these institutions. Guards and prison officials regularly demand bribes for everything from visitation rights to medical treatment. Prisoners who refuse to pay are either physically harmed or deliberately placed in danger by being moved to high-risk areas controlled by violent gangs. Female inmates suffer some of the worst abuses in corrupt prisons. In many cases, they are subjected to sexual exploitation, with guards and male prisoners using them as currency in the underground economy. Some are forced into prostitution, with prison officials profiting from their suffering. Even the so-called rehabilitation programs in these prisons are often scams designed to extort money. Prisoners are promised early release or reduced sentences if they participate, but many find that their efforts amount to nothing unless they can pay off the right officials. The medical conditions in corrupt prisons are often equivalent to death sentences. Without bribes, inmates are denied even the most basic health care, leaving them to suffer from easily treatable illnesses. In many cases, prisoners die from infections, malnutrition, or untreated injuries, while officials falsify records to avoid accountability. Some corrupt prisons operate forced labor camps, where inmates are subjected to grueling work conditions for little to no pay. These operations often benefit private businesses that bribe prison officials to provide cheap or free labor. In some cases, prisoners who refuse to comply are beaten or starved until they submit. The justice system in many of these countries is so broken that innocent people are frequently imprisoned due to corrupt police officers planting evidence or fabricating charges. Once inside, their fate is often determined by their ability to navigate the prison's black market of bribery and extortion. Escape attempts in corrupt prisons are usually met with extreme brutality. If prisoners do manage to escape, guards and officials face scrutiny, leading them to take even harsher measures against the remaining inmates. Some prisons have been known to stage fake executions to instill fear and prevent future attempts. Even when reforms are promised, the deep-rooted corruption in these prison systems makes change almost impossible. Any effort to improve conditions is quickly undermined by those who profit from the existing system, ensuring that the cycle of abuse continues. Inmates who try to expose corruption often face severe retaliation. Whistleblowers are either silenced through physical violence or mysteriously disappear. Some have been found dead under suspicious circumstances, with prison officials claiming they committed suicide. The overcrowding in these prisons is intentional, as it creates a chaotic environment where corruption can thrive. With too many prisoners and too few resources, officials are able to exploit desperation, selling everything from drinking water to basic hygiene products at inflated prices. Even high-profile criminals are able to buy special treatment. In some corrupt prisons, drug lords and mafia bosses live in luxury, with access to private suites, expensive meals, and even personal servants. Their money ensures they are never truly punished, while ordinary prisoners suffer in inhumane conditions. The lack of international oversight allows many of these prisons to continue operating without consequences. While human rights organizations frequently report on abuses, corrupt governments either deny the allegations or refuse to allow inspections. The cycle of corruption is so deeply ingrained that even newly built prisons quickly fall into the same patterns. The same guards, officials, and politicians who benefit from the system ensure that any new facility is just another extension of the same corruption. Prison riots are often the only way inmates can push back against these injustices. However, when they do occur, they are usually met with extreme violence from security forces. Governments use these riots as justification to impose even harsher measures rather than addressing the root causes of the unrest. Some corrupt prisons serve as recruitment grounds for terrorist organizations and extremist groups. With little hope for a better future, inmates are easily radicalized, further destabilizing entire regions when they are eventually released. Many of the worst prisons in the world are located in countries with strong international trade relationships, making foreign governments hesitant to intervene. Economic and political alliances often take priority over addressing human rights violations. Inmates with mental health conditions are some of the most vulnerable in corrupt prisons. Instead of receiving treatment, they are often abused, neglected, or thrown into solitary confinement for years. The lack of accountability means that even when abuses are exposed, few officials ever face consequences. Corrupt prison systems protect their own, ensuring that whistleblowers and investigative journalists are discredited or threatened into silence. Even when corrupt prisons are eventually shut down, their legacy often continues. Former guards and officials simply move to new facilities, bringing their corrupt practices with them. The prison industrial complex in many countries turns incarceration into a for-profit business, ensuring that there is little incentive to truly reform the system. Private companies profit from prison labor, while government officials profit from bribes and extortion. Corrupt prisons are often connected to larger criminal enterprises, with high-ranking officials involved in drug trafficking, human smuggling, and other illegal activities. The psychological toll on inmates in these prisons is immense. Many suffer from severe PTSD, depression, and anxiety, yet they are given no access to mental health resources. Even religious organizations that attempt to intervene in corrupt prisons often face resistance. Many chaplains and humanitarian workers have reported being threatened or forced out when they tried to expose abuses. The presence of children in some corrupt prisons is one of the most horrifying aspects of the system. In countries where juveniles are incarcerated with adults, young prisoners are subjected to the same violence and exploitation. Despite these horrors, many corrupt prisons are still fully operational, with no signs of improvement. The lack of media coverage and international pressure allows them to continue running in secrecy. The systemic corruption within these prisons reflects the larger failures of justice systems worldwide. As long as profit and power are prioritized over human rights, these institutions will continue to thrive. The real tragedy is that many of the inmates in these prisons were victims of poverty, discrimination, or political oppression before they were ever incarcerated. For them, prison is just another chapter in a lifetime of suffering. Without significant structural change, corrupt prisons will remain some of the darkest corners of society, where justice is abandoned and human dignity is stripped away. The ultimate question remains, will the world ever take action? Or will these forgotten souls continue to suffer in silence, lost in a system designed to exploit them? The reality is that corrupt prisons are not just a reflection of failed justice systems. They are an intentional tool used by those in power to control and exploit vulnerable populations. Whether it's through forced labor, extortion, or the silencing of political opponents, these institutions serve a purpose far beyond simple incarceration. Inmates who survive these hellish environments often leave more broken than when they entered. Many are so traumatized by their experiences that they struggle to reintegrate into society, creating a cycle of crime and imprisonment that benefits corrupt officials and private interests. Rehabilitation is nearly non-existent in such prisons. Instead of preparing inmates for life outside, these institutions serve as breeding grounds for further criminal activity. Many prisoners leave more hardened, having learned from the worst criminals within the system. Some countries use corrupt prisons as a means of ethnic or religious persecution. Entire groups are rounded up and imprisoned under the pretense of criminal activity, only to be subjected to forced labor, torture, and even execution. One of the most horrifying examples of systemic abuse within corrupt prisons is organ trafficking. There have been reports of prisoners being executed so their organs could be harvested and sold on the black market, with corrupt officials profiting from the trade. In regions where law enforcement is deeply intertwined with criminal organizations, prisons become recruitment centers. Gangs offer protection to vulnerable inmates in exchange for loyalty, ensuring that their numbers continue to grow both inside and outside of prison walls. Corruption is so deeply embedded in some prison systems that even humanitarian aid is stolen before it reaches inmates. Food, medical supplies, and clothing donated by charities often end up being sold by guards or used as leverage to extract bribes. False imprisonment is a major issue in these corrupt systems. Innocent individuals, particularly from marginalized communities, are often arrested without evidence and thrown into prisons where they are forced to confess under duress. In some countries, prisoners are used as bargaining chips in political negotiations. Governments detain foreign nationals or opposition figures, only to release them in exchange for economic deals or diplomatic concessions. Escape is nearly impossible for most inmates, not just because of physical security measures, but because corruption ensures that even if they manage to break free, someone will always be looking to profit from their capture. Many of these prisons exist in countries where government institutions are weak or non-existent, allowing them to operate without oversight. Even when reforms are announced, they rarely lead to meaningful change because the corruption runs so deep. Prison guards in these institutions often double as executioners. Unofficial death squads within prisons are used to eliminate troublesome inmates, ensuring that any opposition to the corrupt system is swiftly dealt with. Even when major riots or massacres occur, authorities often downplay the events to avoid scrutiny. Reports are falsified, evidence is destroyed, and surviving inmates are threatened into silence. Some of the most notorious prison massacres in history have occurred in corrupt facilities, where guards and police forces have deliberately opened fire on inmates to maintain control or cover up scandals. Journalists who attempt to expose the realities of these prisons often face intimidation, threats, or even assassination. The powerful individuals who benefit from the system have no interest in allowing the truth to come to light. The families of inmates suffer just as much as the prisoners themselves. Many are forced to pay exorbitant fees just to visit their loved ones, and in some cases, they must bribe officials to ensure their relatives aren't killed or tortured. Some prisons openly auction off cell space to the highest bidder. Wealthy prisoners can purchase private rooms, while the poor are crammed into overcrowded, disease-ridden cells where survival is uncertain. There are prisons where inmates are forced to fight each other for the entertainment of guards and high-ranking officials. These brutal fights are sometimes even filmed and sold for profit. Even in prisons where official executions are banned, accidental deaths occur at an alarming rate. Corrupt officials use various methods: intentional neglect, staged suicides, and medical deprivation to get rid of inconvenient prisoners. Many corrupt prison systems benefit from foreign investments. Private corporations, unaware or indifferent to the human rights abuses, fund the construction and management of these facilities in exchange for lucrative contracts. Some prisons have been turned into modern-day slavery operations, with inmates forced to manufacture goods that are then sold on the legal market. These products often end up in major international supply chains, unknowingly purchased by consumers worldwide. In certain corrupt prisons, solitary confinement is used as a form of torture. Inmates are kept in total isolation for years with no contact with the outside world, slowly breaking their minds until they are no longer a threat. For many prisoners, death is a preferable alternative to the suffering they endure daily. Suicide rates in these institutions are often staggeringly high, though many deaths are staged by corrupt officials to cover up murders. Even when international organizations call for the closure of these facilities, corrupt governments find ways to keep them running under different names or simply relocate the prisoners to new but equally horrific locations. Children born inside these prisons often inherit the same suffering as their parents. Some are raised within the walls of the facility, growing up in an environment of extreme violence and corruption with no chance for a normal life. Even when inmates complete their sentences, they often remain trapped in the system. Some are refused release unless their families can pay massive bribes, while others are rearrested on fabricated charges to keep the cycle going. Corrupt prison officials often manipulate parole and pardon systems, ensuring that those who can afford to pay their way out are released early, while poor inmates remain locked up indefinitely. Medical experiments have been conducted on prisoners in some of the most corrupt institutions. Inmates are subjected to unapproved drug trials, surgical procedures, and other forms of human experimentation without their consent. The worst prisons in the world are often hidden from public view, operating in secrecy with no transparency. Governments deny access to journalists, human rights organizations, and even the families of inmates. Corrupt prisons don't just destroy the lives of inmates, they erode entire societies. The culture of bribery, violence, and exploitation spills over into the wider legal system, making justice unattainable for ordinary citizens. In some countries, the prison system is deliberately used to maintain social inequality. Minorities and lower-class citizens are disproportionately incarcerated, ensuring that the elite remain in control. Efforts to reform these prisons are often performative. Governments make grand promises of change, but as long as corruption remains profitable, true progress is nearly impossible. Technology has allowed for some exposure of these corrupt institutions, with leaked footage and testimonies occasionally making it to the public. However, even these revelations often lead to little action. Inmates who attempt to organize or demand better conditions are brutally suppressed. Hunger strikes and protests are met with severe beatings, solitary confinement, or outright execution. The mental and physical scars inflicted by these prisons last a lifetime. Even those who eventually gain their freedom often find themselves permanently damaged, struggling to rebuild their lives in a world that abandoned them. The stories that do escape from these prisons serve as a haunting reminder of how cruel and indifferent the world can be to suffering. Yet, despite the countless reports of abuse, little changes. For many prisoners, hope is the only thing that keeps them alive. But in a system designed to crush all hope, survival itself becomes an act of defiance. As long as corruption remains a key component of the global prison system, these institutions will continue to function as centers of unchecked brutality, profiting from the suffering of those trapped inside. The cycle of corruption in these prisons persists because it is not just tolerated but actively encouraged by those who benefit from it. From government officials to private corporations, there are too many powerful interests invested in maintaining these systems of exploitation. Many of these corrupt prisons operate in countries where the rule of law is fragile or non-existent. Even when scandals break and human rights abuses are exposed, little action is taken because those in charge of enforcing justice are often complicit. The financial incentives for keeping prisons corrupt are massive. Bribery, forced labor, organ trafficking, and illicit trades generate billions of dollars annually, ensuring that those at the top remain invested in the system's survival. In some cases, corrupt prisons are used to suppress entire movements. Activists, journalists, and political dissidents are imprisoned on false charges, ensuring that opposition to the regime is kept under control. For many inmates, the moment they are arrested, their fate is sealed. Court hearings are mere formalities, and sentences are determined not by law but by the highest bidder. Those who can afford bribes walk free, while the poor are condemned. False evidence and coerced confessions are the norm in these corrupt systems. Many prisoners never committed the crimes they were accused of, but under torture and threats, they admit to anything just to end their suffering. Even children are not spared from these horrors. Juveniles are often locked up with hardened criminals, subjected to the same brutality and neglect, with no real chance of rehabilitation. Sexual violence is rampant in many of these institutions. Guards and high-ranking inmates exploit weaker prisoners, often in exchange for privileges or as a means of asserting dominance. In some of the worst prisons, basic human needs like food and water are deliberately withheld. Malnutrition and dehydration become tools of control, ensuring that inmates remain weak, desperate, and compliant. Medical care is practically non-existent in these facilities. Inmates suffering from illnesses or injuries are left untreated, often dying from conditions that could have been easily managed with proper health care. Religious persecution is another disturbing aspect of corrupt prisons. Inmates who belong to minority faiths are singled out for particularly harsh treatment, denied religious materials, and punished for practicing their beliefs. Certain prisons operate like medieval torture chambers. Beatings, electric shocks, waterboarding, and other inhumane punishments are used not only for discipline but for the sadistic pleasure of those in power. The involvement of private companies in prison management has only worsened the problem. When prisons are run for profit, there is little incentive to rehabilitate inmates, as their continued incarceration generates revenue. Despite international condemnation, these prisons continue to operate because they are protected by secrecy. Governments deny access to independent investigators, and whistleblowers who speak out risk their lives. In some cases, entire prison populations have been wiped out overnight in orchestrated massacres. Governments and prison officials justify these killings by framing them as riots or necessary crackdowns on crime. Corrupt prison systems often extend their influence beyond the walls. Former inmates, once released, become entangled in organized crime or political schemes, further strengthening the cycle of corruption. Some of the most infamous prison escapes in history were not acts of defiance but orchestrated events where wealthy or influential prisoners simply paid their way out while officials pretended to be outsmarted. The use of psychiatric institutions as prisons is another dark reality. Political prisoners and dissidents are often declared mentally ill and locked away indefinitely, subjected to forced medication and psychological abuse. Even prison staff who initially enter the system with good intentions are eventually forced to comply with corruption. Those who refuse to participate in bribery or extortion are either transferred, threatened, or eliminated. Family members of prisoners face constant harassment from corrupt officials. They are forced to pay bribes just to get visitation rights, ensure their loved ones receive basic necessities, or even to prevent them from being tortured. Judicial corruption plays a significant role in maintaining these prisons. Many judges receive bribes to hand out excessive sentences, ensuring that the prison population remains high and the system continues to generate profits. Human trafficking networks sometimes operate within these facilities. Prisoners are sold into forced labor, sex slavery, or even used as expendable assets in criminal enterprises run by prison authorities. Corrupt prisons often serve as training grounds for extremist groups. When marginalized individuals are imprisoned unjustly, they become easy targets for radicalization, fueling cycles of violence outside the prison walls. Despite the horrific conditions, some inmates have managed to document their experiences. Smuggled letters, hidden cameras, and escaped whistleblowers have provided glimpses into the atrocities that take place behind locked doors. Even in countries where the justice system is considered relatively fair, certain prisons remain black sites where individuals disappear without a trace. These hidden facilities exist beyond legal oversight, allowing for absolute impunity. In many of these prisons, hope is deliberately crushed. Inmates who attempt to educate themselves, form support groups, or demand better conditions are silenced through extreme punishments, or sudden, accidental deaths. Some prisons allow prisoners to purchase weapons, creating a lawless environment where survival depends on money and power. Those who can't afford protection are left at the mercy of armed gangs. The international community often condemns these prison conditions but rarely takes meaningful action. Political alliances, economic interests, and diplomatic negotiations prevent real intervention. Certain prisons engage in psychological warfare against their inmates. Sleep deprivation, extreme temperatures, and constant surveillance break prisoners down mentally, making them more susceptible to control. Riot police and military forces are sometimes used to suppress uprisings within these prisons. These crackdowns often end in mass casualties, with authorities framing the events as necessary actions to maintain order. Many prisoners who manage to escape these institutions find themselves hunted for life. Governments and prison officials go to extreme lengths to ensure that no one survives to expose the full extent of their crimes. Corrupt prison officials sometimes manipulate media narratives to shift blame onto inmates. When abuses are exposed, they claim that the prisoners themselves are violent criminals who deserve the conditions they endure. In some prisons, entire sections are turned into secret luxury wings where wealthy inmates live in comfort, complete with internet access, gourmet food, and personal servants, all while the rest of the population suffers. Some prisons have been abandoned only for their atrocities to be discovered years later. Mass graves, torture chambers, and evidence of human experimentation have been found in facilities long after they ceased operation. The sheer scale of corruption in these prisons is difficult for many to comprehend. The suffering is so vast and systemic that even when small reforms occur, they barely scratch the surface of the problem. The legacy of these institutions will haunt generations to come. The pain inflicted upon prisoners does not end with them. It spreads to their families, their communities, and the very fabric of society itself. Despite everything, there are still those who fight for justice. Activists, human rights organizations, and even former prisoners continue to risk their lives to expose the truth and demand change. But as long as corruption remains deeply rooted in the global prison system, these horrors will persist, and countless more lives will be lost to the machinery of exploitation and suffering. Prisons have long been a reflection of the societies that create them. In many of the world's most corrupt institutions, justice is not determined by law but by power and wealth. Guards, officials, and inmates all play a role in the cycle of exploitation, ensuring that only those with money or influence survive. While some of these prisons have been shut down or reformed, many others continue to operate in secrecy, hidden from the eyes of the world. As long as corruption remains profitable, the suffering behind bars will continue, turning prisons from places of justice into dens of inhumanity.